All right, and next slide. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Allie Michael. And as I said, I'll also share Eleonora's bio, though she couldn't be with us today. As the director of the Race Institute for K-12 Educators, Allie Michael, PhD, works with schools and organizations around the country to help make research on race, whiteness, and education more accessible and relevant to educators. Allie is the author of Raising Race Questions, Whiteness, Inquiry, and Education, winner of the 2017 Society of Professors of Education Outstanding Book Award. As a member of a multiracial editorial team, she has co-edited the Guide for White Women Who Teach Black Boys, Teaching Beautiful and Brilliant Black Girls, and Everyday White People Confront Racial and Social Injustice, 15 Stories. With her colleague Toni Graves Williamson, Allie adapted Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility for a young adult audience. Allie sits on the editorial board of the Journal of Whiteness and Education. And Eleonora Bartoli, PhD, is a consultant and licensed psychologist specializing in trauma, resilience building, and multicultural social justice counseling. She earned her PhD in psychology, human development, mental health research from the University of Chicago. After receiving her clinical license in 2005, she opened a small independent practice, which she has held since. After 15 years in academia, she became a full-time consultant, and her mission is to share the tools of counseling and psychology in support of social justice work. And now, without further ado, I will hand it off to Allie. So take it away.
Thanks, Melissa. You know, I just realized, unfortunately, I dropped out of Twitter. So if you're looking for me at Allie Michael PhD, look for me at alliemichael.org. I apologize. I didn't catch that before, but I'm a Twitter dropout, so I don't want you to get lost in there looking for me. So welcome, everybody. It's so good to have you all here. I'm really honored that you're here to think about this and think about how white people can contribute to a healthy multiracial society. I think it's one of the most pressing questions of this moment in our country. It's probably been one of the most pressing questions of every moment in our country. But I think it's really important for us to think about this together. And so I'm going to share more from the book that I wrote with Eleonora, mostly in my garage. We wrote this book during COVID when we weren't going into each other's houses. We started off on the phone with, summer of 2020, both of us feeling a lot of despair, a lot of sadness, a lot of confusion, and feeling like all of the white people we talked to were saying, okay, I'm fragile. Now what? Okay, I have racist thoughts. I have bias. But what do I do? Where do I go? And meanwhile, I remember talking to a Native friend on the phone during that time after George Floyd was murdered and saying, like, what am I doing? I'm an educator. I should be a lawyer. I should be a policymaker. I should run for office. And she said, no. Anti-racism, like decolonization, is a practice. It's a daily practice that you engage in on a regular basis. And you wake up and you engage the practice. You walk the path. That's what you do. And you do it using who you are, where you are, the skills that you have, the sphere of influence that you can control. And mine, I'm an educator. I'm a writer. And I am able to share and talk with other white people who are asking similar questions about what do I do? Where do I go? How do I move forward? So I'm going to be talking about this book, which, we wrote it in the garage because we were trying not to give each other COVID. So even as it became winter, it was 30 degrees. We're like both like under blankets in the garage, still writing together. And today we do actually see each other in person in the house now, even though COVID's not over yet. And I want to talk a little bit about this title. So our problem, our path, collective anti-racism for white people. Our problem for me goes way back to my own first learning about racism, which really, I'm going to just share a picture of me when I was growing up. I'm in the blue sweater. somebody said to me in a workshop once, like, you don't have to point out that you're the one in the blue sweater. Everybody knows that's you. I don't know if you're feeling that, but she was feeling that. So this is me and my siblings growing up in a predominantly white suburb where we never talked about race. We didn't talk about racism. We were essentially taught that to be good people, we should be colorblind, and not just by our family, by our whole community. And that really, as long as racism wasn't impacting us, and as long as we were not like overtly racist, spray painting racial slurs or being overtly violent and intentionally racist, racism had nothing to do with us. And it wasn't until I went to college and I took a class on African American literature when I was first asked to start thinking realistically about how racism shaped the world around me and how it had shaped my life. And in fact, I think when I was growing up, if you had said, well, how does being white impact your life, Allie? I would have said, well, it doesn't. Like, I don't even think of myself really as white. I just I'm just human. It's not really about white or something else like that. My life would be the same if I was a different color. And then when I got to college and we started learning some of the history of systemic racism, I remember thinking, what was I thinking? Like, I grew up in an almost all white community. It was 99.8% white. And all white communities don't happen by accident. They happen through like intentional social public policy and through individual acts of violence and policing that kept Black people and other people of color out of our community. In fact, I couldn't have lived in my community realistically if I hadn't been white. Every day of my life up until that point, and still today, was impacted by being white, but I didn't see that at the time. So here I am sitting in this African American literature class, and I'm starting to see myself as white. I'm starting to also come face to face with my own incompetencies. Like, we would try to have conversations about racism, about the books we were reading. And it required me to say things like Black or African American or white. And these were words I'd been taught not to say. And again, it wasn't like there was a big sign on the wall that said, like, you shall be colorblind, you shall not use the word Black. But what I knew is that if you said the word Black, you should whisper. You shouldn't say it out loud. It's like different from other words. You shouldn't say white out loud. You should say white. And so it was in this class where I started realizing I am really bad at talking about this. But racism is clearly has been so formative to our nation that if I don't talk about this, I can't actually do anything about it. If I don't learn to talk about race, I can't do anything about racism. So the other thing, and this gets us to the the problem, was a quote from James Baldwin that I heard that semester where he essentially said, racism is not a people of color problem. It's a white person problem. And it's not going to change until white people do something about it. And that hit me hard because partly, it resonated. Like, sexism is not a woman problem. Women can't stop sexism without men. Transphobia is not a trans person problem. It's a cis person problem. It's not going to change if cisgender people don't do something about it. So I started to see that, like, yeah, racism is a white person problem. As a friend of mine says, it's an everybody problem. A friend of mine who's a person of color says it's everybody's problem, but it's our problem in different ways. And fundamentally, it's my problem in ways I had always been taught that it was not. So I had grown up thinking, racism is over here and it hurts people of color, but as long as I'm not committing racism, it's not my problem. And what I started to realize is here I am over here. It's actually like, this belongs to both of us. This belongs to me. I hold a part of the puzzle. I need to do something about racism. And the quote from James Baldwin, I mean, I think it could sound harsh to people, but it actually, to me, it sounded like an invitation. Like, who, like, here I am saying, like, well, but who am I really to do something about? As I don't know anything about, I can't even have the conversation. I'm white. And he was like, no. We need you. you come on. This is your problem too. So come on and join us. So that's where our problem comes from. The idea that racism is a white person problem. It's not going to change unless people do something about it. But it's also a problem. It's also a thing that hurts white people. Racism is something that hurts white people, and it doesn't hurt us in the same visceral way that it hurts people of color and Native people. It doesn't disadvantage us in the same ways, but fundamentally it hurts us. And so the whole first chapter of this book asks white people to think about, how does racism hurt you? Because when I have a stake in ending racism, not just like because I'm doing it on behalf of somebody else, then I can really work in solidarity with others who are impacted by racism in a way that really changes when I'm not just kind of doing it for somebody else. So recently I was listening to an African-American Policy Forum panel, and there was a law professor from Columbia who said, racism has always been foundational to fascism. Fascism requires that we be able to divide groups and pit them against one another. That's what racism does. And so anti-racism is actually foundational to democracy. I think this is one of the ways that racism hurts white people. It makes us more easy to manipulate, makes us easy to scare. And it makes us think that we don't have common interest or common cause with people of color and Native people who live in our communities, with whom actually, if we lived and worked in solidarity, we would have so much more power to build a healthy nation. And so that's one of the many ways that racism is a white person problem. And then in the first chapter, you'll see many of my personal reasons why it's a problem for me. Our path is about, just like my friend said, it's about getting up and walking the path every day, not knowing, I don't know that I'm going to end racism in my life. I'm certainly not going to end it myself, but it's my job to walk the path and to walk it along with the millions of other white people and people of color and Native people who've walked this path for hundreds of years. The subtitle is about collective anti-racism for white people. And this comes from my belief, or Eleonora and my belief, that we kind of developed, that we put a name to in that garage in the rain during COVID, where basically we felt that what was happening in the US was individualistic anti-racism, where white people were really working hard to show that they were anti-racist, but they weren't working to help other white people take an anti-racist stance. And that comes from a lot of myths that we grew up with around capitalism and white supremacy that teach us to compete, that teach us that it's about winning that matters, about individualism. So for us, we realized, like a long time ago, we realized our tendency to compete with other white people, to try to be like the most anti-racist white person in the room, to be the best ally or whatever. I mean, what does that even mean? But there was a moment in my own learning in an anti-racist learning space when I was in graduate school, where we were sitting around talking about something, and my friend Sue was just like, oh, it just occurred to me, like, it's actually not about being the best white person in the room. It's about ending racism. And the rest of us were like, oh, of course, but we had felt it too, that draw, that need to compete. And I see it in my own relationship with my dad. So early on in my own learning journey about anti-racism, I kind of felt like it was my job to make people feel bad, to feel guilty about racism, because whenever I had conversations or went to workshops about race and racism, I left them feeling guilty or sad or bad. And I remember going home from college on breaks and just fighting with my dad and saying his ideas were racist. And I remember him saying, essentially, like, I'm not going to talk about this with you anymore, because you don't fight fair. You just call me names. And like, there's a lot I don't know. I can't keep up with you. Your ideas don't make sense to me because I haven't read what you've read and I haven't had the conversations that you've had. And so, when I think back on those days, it was almost like, here's me and I'm like the anti-racist and here's my dad. And it was almost like I thought like, well, if he says something racist, my job is to clobber him because I'm anti the racist. And so I got to take him out. And what I've been realizing since then is that it's not about anti-racism doesn't mean I'm against the white person next to me who says something racist. I mean, sure, he says something racist today, but I could be the one saying something racist tomorrow. At the end of the day, we both go to sleep in a society shaped by white supremacy. We don't make things better by me knocking him out. We make things better by me helping him take the next step on his path by learning what he needs to learn to understand why what he said was racist. And so it doesn't shift it significantly. I'm still going to I'm going to challenge him. I'm going to talk with him about it, but I'm going to do so not from a place of trying to prove my own credentials, but rather looking at him and saying, what do you need to know about this? Because at the end of the day, it's not about having like one super conscious white person in the institution or on the block or in the house. It's about having millions of white people walking anti-racist path for the course of their lives. And so what I did with my dad that I think has proven useful is after a couple of years of just like stalemate and silence, I said to him, I'd really like to talk more with you about race and racism because you're important to me. And this journey I'm on is really important to me, but I don't know. I don't have all the answers. I don't know like everything about race and racism, but like, if you have questions, maybe we can explore them together. So my dad was like, okay, let's talk about that. So if race is not biological, why are there more Black players in the NBA than white players? And I was like, I don't know, but let's explore that. So we started talking together and we have been talking ever since. And I believe that my dad has a different influence on his sphere of influence because of he's walking this anti-racist path. He started all kinds of consciousness raising groups at his church. He parents my children he grandparents my children with an anti-racist lens. And he said to me recently, I wish I had a list of all the ways that the falsehoods that I used to believe about Black people that influenced the way I voted, influenced the way I thought about policies, the way I thought about individuals who I came across. And I said, well, let's like make a voice memo. We were driving in the car. Let's just like record it. We don't need a list, so we can record it here. And he talked for like an hour and a half about all the ways his ideas had changed, that he realized that the falsehoods, the biases, the fear that he'd been taught about Black people. And even though he would have said, I treat everybody the same, I don't like to see race, he saw group level disparities as being the fault of members of those groups, rather than really seeing the history and the policy that impacted those groups because it was targeting them specifically. So I mentioned my dad because I want to move towards a collective anti-racism where white people support other white people to take their next steps, because it shouldn't be the job of people of color and Native people to talk gently to white people, to help us learn, fill in the blanks of the history that we don't know, and like hold our hands while we walk. Lots of people of color and Native people do those very things for white people all over the country, all over the world. And yet it shouldn't be their job. People of color and Native people should be able to tell us about their experiences of racism and colonization in ways that are self-protective to them, that help them say what they need to say in order to survive in this country. And they shouldn't be worried about like, how are people going to hear it? But sometimes it's hard for me to hear. And oftentimes I need support. And I need a place to go to ask my stupid questions. And sometimes there are things I don't know that will help me understand what people are telling me. And that's when other white people can be a resource for me. So this book is really, originally the book was going to be called White on White. It's like, how can white people talk to other white people to help them take their next step? So I'm going to keep going. I'm going to share a little bit more. These are my chapters. And the book, it really, I talked about how it starts with racism as a white person problem, and then it starts to talk about the myths that impact how white people interact with one another when we feel like we have to compete with one another. I'm going to talk about those a little bit today. Then for chapters 3 and 4, I talk about what white people learn about race as children based on the research, and then what could we learn? What could we be teaching white children to help them have a strong positive racial identity as white people and to feel the agency and the competency to be able to contribute to a healthy multiracial society? So this is a chapter for children, but it's also for any white person who thinks, yeah, I didn't really get anti-racist socialization as a kid. What could I have learned? What should I have learned? Chapter 5 is about a question that a lot of people ask. Can white anti-racist people feel proud of being white? Why is pride not part of the racial identity development framework? So that's a cliffhanger. I'm going to let you read the chapter, see what you think. Send me your feedback. Chapter 6 is on who is white and why, and some of the history of that category, because I know there are a lot of people who get treated as white, who receive white privilege, but who don't necessarily identify with that. Many Ashkenazi Jews, European descended Jews, some people who appear white but have immigrated to the US, sometimes people who are Italian American but grew up as children in the 1950s and didn't get treated as white people. So there are a lot of people who don't fit neatly into the category of whiteness. That chapter is for them to think about how they can live into the benefits they get from whiteness with integrity. Not live into the benefits, but live into that identity that people project onto them with integrity and be accountable for the benefits they receive. And then, and also be clear for themselves about who they are. Then 2 chapters on taking feedback and talking to other white people about race. Chapter 9 is about having an anti-racist learning space. And chapter 10, I co-wrote with Eleonora. It's about taking action, how to, again, take action where you are with who you are right now, today, and to keep getting better. Eleonora wrote basically a mini chapter that comes after each one of my chapters. She's a psychologist, and her chapters, I mean, honestly, when I have a moment where, like, I had a moment in a workshop a couple of weeks ago where one of my participants was very offended by something that I said. I had been sharing an example of, the workshop was on how to talk to white kids about race, and I had been sharing an example of something a white child had said. And I repeated it without kind of warning the group. And she was the only Black participant in the group, and she really struggled with it. And she contacted me afterwards, again, so generously, and said, I know that this workshop is about talking to white kids about race. I know I should expect examples like that, but I needed a little something because that was really hard to hear. And I started having a physiological reaction to her email. I am not in this line of work to hurt people, certainly not to hurt people of color. And I just felt really sad. But I also had like a physiological reaction where I kind of was outside my body, looking at my body. I felt like I was like in the 4 corners of the room. I was losing my peripheral vision. I felt a little nauseous. I felt like I wanted to cry. All of these are very normal things that people in a human body experience when they encounter a moral injury, which is when we violate our own moral code, which is basically anytime we do anything racist, when we're trying to be anti-racist. So Eleonora's chapters help you process what's going on in your human body as you try to learn about racism, to talk about racism, and to take action. And so after each one of my chapters, you get something, a little piece from Eleonora. And I go back and I had to read her chapter I think I read Don't Get Stuck in Stereotype Threat in order to continue to engage with my participant in an authentic, connected way that wasn't reacting out of defensiveness or sadness or fear or blaming her. I just wanted to connect with her. So these are Eleonora's chapters, and you'll see, I want to just share the three main concepts that she covers that really, I think, are a brand new contribution to the literature on white anti-racism. Because essentially, like when we think about things like white fragility or like bias, and why is it so hard to essentially break out of those, or why is it hard to acknowledge the harm that we do? Eleonora says, well, there's actual psychological reason involving stereotype threat, moral injury, and racial anxiety. And so she goes into each one of them to help people think more about growing up in a society so heavily shaped by racism as something that injured us, that harmed us. So I think sometimes white people feel like, well, what's wrong with me? I'm white. And I have this bias, like, what's wrong with me? And she says, that's not the right question. It's not what's wrong with you. It's what happened to you? What happened to you that you grew up in a society that taught you these falsehoods and that turned you against people who are other human beings and made you think that you're fundamentally separate? So her pieces on these concepts are just liberating to me. And they're so powerful because it's like working with a therapist. You break through some of those blocks that get in the way of taking action. I'm going to share a little more about racial anxiety, because she says fundamentally, one of the reasons why as white people, we often are asking ourselves, and I know not everybody on this call is white or identifies as white, but I want to talk about white people for a second or an hour. And I want to include myself as a white person. I'm not separate from white people. And what white people tend to do, myself included, is, now I explained that and I forgot what I was going to say. It's gone. It'll come back. But I'm going to go into the thing about racial anxiety, because this is one of the concepts that she introduces. Oh, this is what she says. She says, oh, what white people tend to do is ask, how do I take action? What do I do? Just tell me what to do and I'll do it. And she says, actually, if white people can stay in empathetic connection with people of color and Native people, we will know how to take action. The reason we don't know is because we're like flailing about trying not to feel empathy, not to feel anxiety. And so she says, we have racial anxiety, and then that turns us towards fight, flight, or freeze. So even like, tell me what to do. I'll do whatever, I'll take action, however you say. It's like, that's a fight reaction. Or flight, like, I shouldn't even be teaching this class. I don't know. I just keep getting it wrong. I'm the wrong person for this job. Or freeze, where like we actually don't know what to do. Those things come up because it's hard for us to handle the racial anxiety if we're not practiced at processing or moving through racial anxiety. And that is blocking us from staying in the empathetic connection that could be the fuel. Empathetic connection is the fuel for staying on the path, for staying connected, for knowing where we're going, for knowing what we're doing. And so this means we have to figure out how to process racial anxiety. So I was working recently with Dr. Howard Stevenson, who's one of my mentors. He's a professor of psychology and human development at the University of Pennsylvania, and he studies racial anxiety, particularly in Black people. But we were presenting together, we were talking, and I said, sometimes it just feels so, I don't know, like, as a white person to be thinking about processing racial anxiety, like it's really important, but like so often the things that we struggle with are, I don't know what words to use. I don't know what to say. I don't want to say the wrong thing. I feel like I'm walking on eggshells, and it's just like, it's so small compared to what people of color are dealing with, particularly Black Americans, around the risks that they face into their very lives or their children's lives on a regular basis. It just, am I wasting my time talking about white people's racial anxiety? And he was like, no. Can you imagine what life would be like for people of color in the US if there wasn't so much racial anxiety coming at us all the time from white people? How much we could connect, how much we could process, how much more we would be listened to, how much less we would be in danger. White people's racial anxiety is that's like fundamentally what puts us in danger. And so when white people deal with their racial anxiety, when we cultivate and rebuild that empathetic connection with people of color and Native people, we actually are doing the work that helps to transform our society. So I can't say enough about Eleonora's work in this book, and I'm so grateful for her. Part of how her contribution came in was that I was telling her about all the ideas I had, and she would say, yeah, but there's a psychological principle behind that. Or the reason you're able to talk to white people in a way that they can listen is because you're grounding yourself in this way. You're thinking about their development, not your own. So she would continuously analyze the things I would say and do. And I would say, oh, you have to write that down. Oh, you have to write that down. And so finally she did. And we have it in this book so that you can hear really like the internal work and the external work simultaneously. So I wanted to talk briefly about the myths that show up in the relationships between white people. And there are 6 myths that you can read here, but I'll go through them each one at a time. And I'm just going to talk about how we can counter these myths because they show up in harmful ways. They're myths that come from, you could say, white supremacy. They also come from capitalism. They come from essentially living in a society shaped by a racial hierarchy. We have this racial hierarchy that has been built into our laws and institutions for the last 500 years that puts white people at the top. And that shapes our behavior, our sense of self, the way that we interact. And then it can really get in the way of either building a white collective, white anti-racist collective anti-racism, white anti-racist collective anti-racism. That's like too many anti-racisms. Luckily, they don't negate each other. A white anti-racist collective, but they also get in the way of our relationships with people of color and Native people and make it very hard to work in solidarity. So I'm going to just go through each one and just say a little bit about like how it gets in the way and what we could do differently. So the first one is the idea that we should be colorblind, which so many people grew up with. I actually grew up with this thinking that it came from my family or that it came from my community. And it wasn't until recently that I heard in Alicia Garza's book, she has a book, she's one of the founders of Black Lives Matter, and she has a book called The Purpose of Power. And she talks about how it was actually a strategy from the federal government under Reagan to teach people you should be colorblind because it's the racists who talk about race, because they were trying to frame Black nationalists as racists, as bad, as outside of the national interests. And I had never put that together before, but it's interesting because it's not interesting. I think it's important right now in this moment where we have lots of messages at the national level that are not necessarily coming from the government. That many of them are coming from right-wing news outlets that are trying to tell us that it's racist to talk about race. It's bad to talk about race. So when this myth shows up, there are lots of ways that we can interrupt it. I invite people to talk about the difference between racial talk and racist talk. That like we can't actually end racism if we don't engage in racial talk, but that's different from engaging in racist talk, which really perpetuates and reifies the racial hierarchy. Incidentally, Dr. Stevenson once told me when I was really struggling with my dad, I was so frustrated with my dad for saying he was colorblind. And Howard said, it comes from a good place. And Howard's a Black professional who's, I don't know, 10 years younger than my dad, but he was so forgiving. He says, it comes from a good place. Like, honor the place, honor the goodness that it's coming from, and then talk to him about it. But don't write off the part that is well-intended, because it actually does matter. And I found that to be really helpful in supporting my dad, and continuing to grow with him. So one of the ways to interrupt colorblindness is to also help people think about not just like, don't be colorblind, but like, what should we be? Like, well, so often kids hear, don't be colorblind or don't be racist. But it's like, okay, but then what? And so we want to help people think about what racial competency could look like. Racial competency is like a skill set for navigating racial anxiety, racially stressful situations, a racially complex society. So racial competency is beyond just knowledge. It is knowledge, but it's also self-awareness, skills, and action for doing two things: recognizing racism and intervening with it. That's what we're trying to do. Racial competency is about building the knowledge, self-awareness, skills, and action to recognize racism, to see it, and to do something about it in two places, both inside ourselves and outside ourselves. That's what we're going for. And I think being able to talk about that, this is also in the book in chapter 2, helps people think about what they can proactively move towards, because it's not about just like, don't do this, don't be bad, don't make microaggressions, don't say racist things. It's also about having the skills and competency to navigate a racially complex society. Myth number 2 is that we can and we should be perfect. We should never make mistakes. And my colleague, Sarah Halley, says, well, but it's funny because if figure skaters, if they never made mistakes, they never learn how to do the complicated things that they do. They have to actually learn how to fall and recover. They have to fall and recover 1,000 times before they can do the triple axel or whatever it is that they do. And so we need to interrupt the idea that we're never going to make mistakes. We're human beings. We're human beings who were socialized within a society to have a lot of wrong ideas about race and racism, also about ourselves, about our history. So we need to be able to learn and make mistakes and support one another to make those mistakes and to keep learning from them. The third one is the idea that we should compete and win. I don't know where this comes from. This is like the best anti-racist idea. It's like, I do know where it comes from, but it's just so funny to think that we could only have one white anti-racist. So another colleague of mine talks about the lean. She talks about the way if a white person says something racist, other white people will lean away from them because it's like, oh, I don't want people to know that I'm with them. I don't want them to think I'm like that white person. And she says, no, we need to start to lean toward each other and say, like, let me help you understand what was problematic about that. I don't want to isolate you. I don't want to close you out of the circle of belonging. I want to bring you in and help you learn how to be a part of the circle in a way that honors everybody who's in it, which means unlearning the racist ideas. It also means recognizing that I was not socialized so differently from you, and I wouldn't actually know what I know if it weren't for other white people and people of color and Native people who've helped me learn. So the fourth myth is about internalized dominance and recognizing that white people who were raised within a racial hierarchy often believe that their way is the right way. And this refers to how we lead conversations, how we construct emails, how we like create an event that's supposed to be anti-racist. I mean, repeatedly, that's why there's so so many quotes about white liberals. Like they want to be on your side, but they can be the most destructive. White folks who want to be in solidarity with people of color who have not internalized their own who have no awareness of their own internalized dominance, are going to be destructive in those relationships. And so it's important just to like name that and see it. I have a colleague who I often lead workshops with, who's a Black non-binary person. And at one point we were like trying to plan together and they said, Allie, you have to stop because you have so many ideas. It's making me feel like I don't have any. So I need you to just like stop and be quiet because my internalized oppression is so loud right now. And internalized oppression I think it's a much more commonly talked about phenomenon. But we don't talk about the flip side to that, which is internalized dominance. And so when they said, my internalized oppression is so loud right now, I remember saying, yeah, and I don't know what's going on with my internalized dominance, but I bet it's loud. Because the more you say, yeah, great idea. Oh, that's great. And the more you don't have ideas, the more I think, yeah, good thing I'm in this partnership because I got so many ideas. And it's to their credit that they are able to see that dynamic in them and then help me slow down, because I don't actually want to be in a partnership where I'm the only one setting the agenda. That doesn't make any sense. Not only because I'm white and there's a lot that I miss about race and racism, but because like I wouldn't need to be in partnership if I'm the only one doing it. I could just do it on my own. I saw this quote today on Facebook: "You can't beat me. I want you to win too." I'm not sure that maybe that should be on the other slide, but it just struck me like, yeah, the end, like I'm not trying to be better than the person next to me. I'm not in competition with other people working against racism. Racism is the competition. Racism is what we're trying to end. The fifth myth is that we should think about racism and not feel about it. And for me, what this means, this is really connected to me for me to the idea of like rebuilding that empathetic connection, because I believe, and I think there's a lot of historical evidence to suggest that white people have really been socialized out of empathetic connection to people of color, particularly to Black Americans. So Isabel Wilkerson, in her book Caste, has this powerful paragraph about the ways that it was illegal for white people to live near each other, to marry one another, to have children with each other. And all of these different laws that prevented us from being in community together, from being in family together, made it almost impossible to have empathy across that white-Black divide, because people didn't know each other. They didn't love each other. And then when you take, what happened to Black Americans during enslavement and the ways that white Americans could see it, but didn't do anything about it, and often couldn't do anything about it, and had to cut themselves off from it. It's like that break is a way that the empathetic connection has been severed. And so I really think that part of my work as a white person working to be anti-racist is to rebuild that empathetic connection, and to really like the learning, the knowledge is important, but that's my way in. I went to grad school to learn about racism. It's also a lived experience, but as a white person, it's harder to access the lived experience. But the feeling part, I have to do things to cultivate it. And so in addition to my relationships and my friendships, I cultivate the feeling, the connection by working at it, by reading autobiography, by reading fiction, by when there's a news article about somebody, for example, Tyree Nichols a couple of months ago, I set aside time to sit with the story of who Tyree Nichols was and what happened to him, and to just really feel it and to cry about it. And I know that there's this rule that white people shouldn't cry, about racism, but I feel like part of the problem with that, the rule exists so that white people don't dominate conversations, don't stop the conversation from happening with our tears because it's too painful for us, or don't refocus the attention on us away from the people of color in the conversation. But if I'm sitting alone in the car waiting for my child and I have an hour and a half to read an article and cry, I'm going to take that time and do that to really rebuild that empathetic connection, to let the stories of what happens in our country because of racism permeate and sink in so that they're part of me. Okay, the last one is about countering the myth that race is real. It's like with anti-racism, we have to both acknowledge that race is a social construction and that racism is real, that it has a big impact on our lives. Okay, I'm gonna stop there and see what kind of questions people have. And your questions may be about supporting and challenging other white people. You might have other questions, but we'll go with, I'll let Melissa ask, so that I want to make sure that we get your voices in before we close.
Yeah, thank you so much, Allie. That was a really wonderful presentation and overview of the book. So if you have questions for Allie, please put them in the chat now. And before we get to people's questions, Allie, I'm hoping that you could talk a little bit about the summer book club that you're launching, Beyond the Book Club. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, thanks, Melissa. I'm so excited. I hope that people are going to take this up. So I'm really, one of our main goals with this book is to have white people have the chance to think about themselves, to think about what they need to do in order to be in strong, right relationship with people of color and Native people, but also to foster connections with other white people to help themselves and other white people take the next step on their anti-racist path. So the book club is, it's called Beyond the Book Club, because ideally it's not just a book club. It's a place where we'll also be fostering skills and self-awareness for the purpose of ultimately taking action. But the book club is going to take place over the summer. And so Melissa's going to drop a link into the chat. The goal is for you to either, you could have a book club with one other person. You could have a book club with up to 20 people. We recommend not more than 20. I think 6 to 8 is the ideal number, but the invitation is to just sign up for the book club. And in doing so, you're either saying, I want to be I have some other folks I want to read a book about anti-racism with this summer. I'm going to choose this book and we're going to do it. Or I want to read this book, but I don't know who I would read it with. And then we could place you in a book club with other folks. I encourage so I think anybody of any racial background can sign up, but if you are not white and you want to be in a group with other people of color, let me know. There's a place to just kind of make a note, because I think it's important that this is a book that supports white people to talk to other white people, which does not mean it doesn't speak to people of color. I have found that, in fact, in many of my audiences, it's people of color who resonate more deeply with some of the messages of this book than white people. So I'm still trying to figure that out. And I don't want to put any limits on the book club, but I just want to let you know what you're getting into if you're a person of color signing up, because this really is a book that speaks to white people and, or that is intended to speak to white people. So, if you sign up for the book club, you get 30% off the cover price of the book. We'll give you some logistical support, and then we're going to do a big old get together on Zoom with some Q&A and hanging out and meeting each other at the end of the summer. So I encourage you to sign up if you want to be a part of that.
Thank you so much. So we do not have any questions yet in the chat. I know sometimes it can feel there's some awkward questions that might come up or people might feel sensitive.
I have some things I want to share, Melissa. So will you keep an eye
great.
on if people have questions?
Absolutely.
We'll go to them. So I want to share two things. One is that another thing that came out as we were writing this is that I was reading all these stories about white people who had rescued for lack of a better word, I think it is the right word, who rescued their children from white nationalist groups. And one of the things that became obvious as you read the narrative, as I read the narratives of white families who were wrestling with this, was that their sons, mostly sons, had joined white nationalist groups because they wanted a place where they felt respected and they felt like they could belong. And I remember thinking, this is so twisted, because white nationalists and white supremacist groups are overt, avowed hate groups, but they're recruiting young people, young white people, with love and belonging. Whereas what we have, anti-racism to me, is a love movement. We have a love movement. The goal is to build a healthy, multiracial society, democracy, community. And yet I think a lot of times people feel, they really bristle. They really feel like, well, I don't know the right words, or I'm going to get called out, or this is not the right, this is not a community I feel like I belong or I want to belong. And so part of what we're trying to do with this book is help people see that anti-racism can be a love movement. It's supposed to be a love movement. And that when we can reach out to one another with humility and chutzpah, with humility and love, then we can help one another move forward. And so the goal is to have millions of white people walking an anti-racist path for multiple generations.
Thank you, Allie. And we do now have a few juicy questions in the chat. So we have one question about the book club. I guess if you are half white and half Puerto Rican, there is no place for you in the book club. Can you respond to that?
There's a place for everybody in the book club. There's a place for everybody. And in fact, if you're half white and half Puerto Rican, you can be in any book club. I'm just saying, if you wanted to be in your own, if you wanted to be in a person of color group, mark that down. So I would leave that up to you. But if you are happy to be in a group with white people, you should be in it. I just don't want anybody to start reading the book and say, this really is a book about white people talking to white people. It's not for me. But like I said, most people of color that I've worked with and talked to have felt like there was a lot they got from this book, even though it is explicitly written to white people. So absolutely join the book club. I just don't want you to, I don't want to sell a false bill of goods, where people are like, oh, I bought this book, but it's not really for me. So I just want to be clear, but there's no limits on the book club on who's allowed to join.
Thank you. We have another question from Julie. How would you approach talking about racist talk and racial talk with middle school students?
So I think I would start by just saying, what do you think is the difference between racial talk and racist talk? This is a distinction that comes from Michael Omi and Howard Winan. And they have been working on racial formation for a long time, but they make this distinction between racial talk and racist talk. And when you put it to a class, they're often able to say, like, it forces them to puzzle through the difference. And, for me, I can remember being a camp counselor and asking kids to choose between white bread and brown bread, and then having them call me racist because they're like, oh, Allie made us choose between white and brown. And I'm like, I don't know, am I racist? This is bread, but like, I didn't know what to do. And like, I thought that they were, I was afraid that they were right in their accusation. Because I think middle schoolers like to call things racist, and sometimes it's not racist at all. It has nothing to do with racism. And sometimes it really does have connections to racism in ways that we can't even see, or that I can't see right away. And then slowly I see it as the child explains it to me. But so I think letting them differentiate, racial talk tends to allow us to talk about how race is part of our identities, our communities. It helps us talk about racism, understand racism, confront it, challenge it. But racial talk also looks at history and policy to explain group level racial disparity. And Ibram Kendi would call that anti-racist talk. As racial talk, it's also anti-racist to say if there's group level racial disparity is caused by group level policy. Whereas racist talk tends to stereotype, mock, demean, it reinforces the racial hierarchy, but it also blames individuals for group level disparity. So why is there often a wage gap, for example, between Black Americans and white Americans in the same city? Why do white Americans tend to have 10 times the net worth of Black Americans? Well, racist talk would say it's because white people are industrious and Black people are not. Racist talk would blame the individual, whereas racial talk blames the policy that treated us as separate groups to begin with and gave us different access to resource and opportunity. So those are the main things that I would go through with your kids once you've had them tussle through the difference.
Okay, another juicy one. From Alberto. How do you become a strong advocate for people of color to ensure that they are not marginalized in companies and educational systems?
I think that's a really great question. I mean, part of it is, if I'm a white person trying to be an advocate, part of what I need to do is be in relationship with people of color at my workplace. It's hard to just like say, I know there's not like always one right answer of how to move forward, because it's not, because often there are things already in the works that people are already working on or advocating on that they need support for. But I don't need to like start my own campaign. So part of it is starting by being in a relationship and doing my own work so that I'm ready to be in that relationship. And then, the taking action actually becomes easy once I'm in relationship or once I know what other people are working for. But it requires, I say it's easy. It's not easy. But when I'm doing my own internal exercises, like we've laid out in this book to really help me deal with some of the things that get in the way of me taking action, my fear of making a mistake, my fear of offending the institution. When I've confronted those things, then I'm, one of the chapters that Eleonora has is called Training for Courage. And it's about the skills that we need to be able to face something that feels scary and do it anyway, like to move through the fear. One of the things we like to say is that firefighters are not just brave. They have teams, they have skills, they have extensive training, they have the right uniforms. And this is what we want to give people, is like we want to train white people for courage so that they can work in solidarity with their colleagues of color and their Native colleagues with all the skills and the resources and the uniforms. We don't have uniforms, but the team that they need to be able to have the courage that it requires to do hard work, which is building multiracial community together. I see we're up against the time, so now I'm getting
We are up against the time, and I just put in the chat. I know there were a couple more remaining questions, but we do have to wrap up. So if you had a question that didn't get answered, I put my email address in the chat, melissa.duclos@corwin.com, and I can pass along questions to Ali and Eleonora. We will wrap it up there. Thank you so much, Ali, for your time and your insights and your wisdom.
Thanks, Melissa. Congratulations, everybody. I'll see you out there on the path.